So today is the first lecture, and the course is data structures. Data structures basically mean containers for data, where we store data and work with them. We have come across data structures already in CSE110 and 111, arrays or list, and of course variables, the simplest of all. If you're working with Python do not have arrays, they have list. But if you're working with Java or C, these languages, in fact, most languages have these two data structures separately. There are arrays and there are lists. Arrays and lists both store multiple data. The difference is arrays are of fixed length. By fixed length, we mean we create an array with a fixed length. For example, this is an array of length 4, and we can store 4 values inside this array. In case we need to save the fifth one, we need to resize this array and then insert the next element. So this is a lot of work we'll see in the future. But list is a data structure where the length is dynamic. By this we mean we can add as many values we want, any number of values. We can create as many values we want. No fixed length. So this is the advantage. What Python uses is a bit more advanced, a combination of arrays and list. We call it an array list. In the future, we'll see list does not allow random access, means lists usually do not have indices. You have to work sequentially. But array list is a data structure that allows dynamic length and index. So there's random access available, and we can add as many elements we want. So although when we working with Python, we work with array list or just list, as we call it, but we need to understand how arrays work. So far, we have worked with list, and we know how to insert element. We know how to delete an element or elements. We know how to do a search. We know how to sort, right? So we've done these in the previous two courses, 110 and 111. So I'm not going to run over this here again. So we'll jump into something new. We call it rotate and shifts, left and right shift, and we have left and right rotate. By shift, we mean suppose we have an array of numbers or a list of numbers or elements, doesn't have to be numbers. If we do a left shift, all the elements will move to the left by one space. This is left. All the elements starting with 1, 1 will move left. This means I'll lose 1, 1 will be lost. The very first element will be lost because if we move this towards the left, you know, there's no variable to save it. 2 will move to the left, so this 1 will be replaced by 2. 2 will be replaced by 3. 3 will be replaced by 4, and 4 will be replaced by 5. And at the end, there will be an extra 5 because we are copy and pasting, and we have to replace this 5 with 0. So when we move the elements to the left, the very first element gets lost, and there's an empty space created by which we denote by a 0. This 0 will not be an automatic, will not come automatically. You have to make it a 0. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I was wondering if there's any function to do this, or you need to use something else to do it.
This is a function. We have to write these in a function.
Okay.
So the resultant array will look like this. And this one is lost. When we do a right shift, it's the same thing except for the elements will move to the right. If this is our array, this is right, all the elements will move to the right. And this one gets replaced by a 0. So this is the definition of right and left shift. So now let's look how this is done. So I'll focus more on the mechanism or the algorithm rather than coding. I'll leave the coding part on to you. So I'm not going to show 100%. Okay, I'm not going to code 100% for you, but I'm going to show you algorithm or pseudocode. So let's see how it's done. Let's start with a left shift. We have to move everything towards the left. I take a variable at index number 0, and then I move the elements of the next index to I, which means if the list is called A, I move the next element to I, and this will continue from the beginning to the end, which means I have to run a loop. Therefore, I can start like this. Over here, my loop will run up to length -1. I'll explain why. Then I do the shifting. Let's trace. I starts from 0. I is less than length -1. I move the next element to the previous index. I do an increment of I move to the next index. Same thing happens, 2 gets replaced by 3. I move to the next index. 3 gets replaced by 4. I do an increment. My loop stops when I reaches the last index. See, I did this because if I moved if I continued the loop, I plus 1 doesn't have anything. I plus 1 is an invalid index. So my code would be wrong. My program will be wrong. Therefore, I stopped at the very last index. When I stop over here, what I have to make is, I have to make it a 0. So outside the loop, I do this. I replace the element with a 0. You understand, everybody?
Yes, sir. It's clear.
It's pretty simple, okay? It's not a new data structure we're learning today. It's just one which you can say some, you know,
Yes, sir.
some fun with loops and all. Very basic.
In that case, you could do it with a for loop as well, right?
Yeah, you may use for, you may use while, no problem. I'm comfortable with while.
All right.
You can go ahead and use for loop. You can go for while. It's the same thing. No problem. I like using while. That's it.
Okay, sir.
If you look into right shift, it's the same thing, but the elements will move to the right. So if you need to move the elements to the right, I have to start from the very last index. So unlike left shift, we start I from the very last index, that is length of A minus 1. And I have to move I up to 0. So my loop goes up to 0, right? I'm not going to make equal to 0 because if I continue my loop when I reaches 0, then I will try to access the index I minus 1, which would be wrong. Therefore, I stop when I reaches 0. And over here, what I have to do is replace ith value with the value in the previous index, which is I minus 1. And then you decrement. When you reach index number 0, what you do is add an extra 0. So you see the difference between a left and a right shift? And a left shift, we started from index number 0 and I moved forward this direction. And this one, I started from the last index. Any questions so far?
No, sir.
Am I going too quick?
No, sir.
Okay. Next we have rotate. The only difference between rotate and shift is in shift we lose data and rotate we don't. If we do a right rotate, after shifting all the elements to the right, this value gets to index number 0 instead of a 0. You understand? This is what happens in rotation, in a right rotation. We shift the elements, but instead of throwing this value away, we save it and then bring it back to index number 0. In a left rotate, we do the same thing. Instead of throwing this value away, we bring it back to the last index. So what changes should I make? So this was right shift, the code of right shift. What changes do you have to make it a right rotate? Any answers? Any guesses? Before I start replacing the numbers, I have to save this value. Okay, this is, oh, sorry, this one. Okay, let's show it in a fresh page. And a right rotate, we move to the right. What we do is we save the last value before replacing the numbers. So before we start the loop, we use a temporary variable and save this number. So I use the temporary variable x and saved the last element, and then I started my loop. And at the end, instead of replacing with the 0, instead of replacing the first number with the 0, I replace it with x, which means I'm replacing the first number with 4, and the rest of the numbers get shifted by one space. So rotation is basically it's 90% shifting, except for the fact that the end value, the first one or the last one, does not get lost. We save it in temporary variable and bring it back. If it's a right rotate, the last value gets rotated. It comes back to the first index. If it was a left rotate, the first value would go to the last index. You understand the difference? So today is the first lecture this week. So I'm not going to start any new data structure today. So what I'm doing is, these are very basics. I'm quite sure you won't face any problem with shift and rotates because you are very, for the past 2 semesters, you're doing CSE110 and 111. You've done a lot of work with loops and conditions. I don't think you should be facing a problem with ifs and whiles anymore. Okay, so I've got a question for you. So you've seen so far we're shifting by one space. What if I ask you to shift or rotate an array or list by 3 spaces? By 3 spaces, I mean if this was my array if I did a right shift by 3 spaces, my answer would look like this. This means I do a shift by 1 space 3 times. Right shift by 3 spaces means I'm doing right shift 3 times. So when I this is my original array. When I do a right shift 3 times, this is the result. So can you tell me how to do this?
Sir, we'll create a function for the shift, and then in a loop we'll run it 3 times.
Yeah, great. Well, there are basically two ways to do it. First way is we shift these numbers directly. If this is 3, we'll shift directly or move these numbers directly at these 3 spaces, or we can do what you said. I can write a function for shifting 1 space, and then either call it 3 times or use an extra loop, right? Run this. We go back. This portion was the code for rotation by 1 space. If we let's use a different variable. If we use another loop around it, this means this portion of code will run 3 times, which means there will be 3 times. This rotation will take place 3 times. Okay. So if I ask you to rotate or shift n number of times, what you do is pretty simple. Replace this 3 with n, so n can have any values you want or the user wants, right? What we can do is start with a, and then shift or rotate 1 space. This portion of code is shift and rotate 1 space, and when I run it n number of times, eventually we'll have shift or rotate n number of spaces. Okay. So anybody got questions?
No, sir, it's clear.
Okay, I might be going a bit quick today because these are not something new to you. Okay, the concept of shift, definition of shift and rotate might be new, but we haven't done anything new. Like we've used loops and no if conditions at all, just loops.
Yes, sir.
From the next lecture, from the next week, we're going to look at new data structures. Okay. So in
So,
this week, yeah, do you have any
what's
question?
yeah, what are we gonna exactly learn for, like, actually that is actually from data structure that is in next class?
So we've started data structure from the very first day we started learning programming, which is basically a list or an array,
Hmm.
and we're gonna learn new things from the next week.
Okay, sir.
So in this weekend, we'll have some work to do. That is, One of those are go to box and go through week 1 lectures. And then go through the lecture of circular array. This is something very new to you guys, okay? Circular array. I don't expect you to understand, but it's pretty easy. Like once you go through the contents, things get a bit familiar when we do a live session, okay? So go to the hold on. So go through the lecture of the contents we've gone through today, and then study a bit of circular array. And then there's a very important thing you must do. That is, if you think, if you think you lack knowledge on objects and classes, if you're not 100% sure that you know objects and classes, make sure you know them. Okay, these were taught in the previous course, CSE111. And objects and classes, understanding objects and classes are vital for CSE220. If you don't understand objects and classes 100%, you won't make it through 220, okay? Because once we're done with the arrays, we're going to move into a very a bit I wouldn't say complicated, I'll say a bit advanced data structures that involves only classes and objects. So if you're not sure what classes and objects are, how they work, you're gonna be in very big trouble. So make sure you know these. And yeah, if you go to Slack, I've given a link and there's a book. I want you guys to read books, okay? And by next week, I think you'll be assigned a student tutor. So if you have lackings, if you have questions on previous courses, please talk to him or her. I mean, at the earliest convenience. Don't delay for midterm or final. The major reason why students do not go through 220 is because objects and classes. They know arrays, they know list, but about 80% of 220 is covered by these two things. Okay? Please keep this in mind. So any more questions? Do you have any more questions? If not, then we're going to end today.
What exactly are we going to do with objects and classes in relation to data structures?
So
If
we'll
you could
see it in the
explain.
next 2 weeks, maybe.
All right, sir. Then I have no more questions.
So if there are no more questions, we'll end today.
Sir, when will our lab sessions start? We're supposed to have
From
one tomorrow.
from next week.
Next week? Okay.
Yeah, from next week.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Sir, uh, for our quizzes and assignments, do we have to use Java or Python?
This is an option. You can use either Java or Python, but I suggest you learn both the languages. Learn both the languages.
Okay, sir, since I think this is the first semester we're doing Java, so could you differentiate some of the differences between Java and Python? That would be really helpful.
Python is more of a high level than Java. In both are high level languages, but Python is a bit more high level. High level means easier, less complicated than Java. So according to me, if you're starting to learn a programming language, you should go for C or Java. So when you use Python's very easy. A lot of things you don't need to think. But while programming in Java or C, you need to think a lot. So at the very beginning, I think thinking is a good thing. Spending time. But still, in this course, it's an option. You can go for either Java or Python, it's your wish. But I
Thank
suggest
you,
you
sir.
learn both the languages.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, then goodbye.
Right. Bye, sir.
Thank you,
Bye,
sir.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
See you next week.
Thank you, sir.
Inshallah.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.